We've got the second live RedZone. This is going to be the defense innovation event, and this is the second one, so I'm really excited about it. James, should we tell people about the secret image, or let people figure it out?
No, they got to figure that one out.
Okay, they got to figure it out.
You can't spoil it by telling them about the secret code.
All right, there is a secret code. We're not going to tell you about it. Maybe a little till later. All right, so let's get started. So James and I decided that we were going to, after doing hundreds of security assessments, what's the most often missed suite of technologies that we're finding, and how does that, and then discuss each one. And so if you're listening, you're going to see, well, 100 assessments have been accomplished, and we're synthesizing all of this into essentially what we would consider the 20% that adds 80% of the value. So if you're thinking, you've heard me talk about the Pareto principle, it's, okay, what's the smallest amount that gets us the biggest bang for our dollar? So we're going to talk about that. All right, let's get started. James, why don't you, I did my little intro. Why don't you introduce yourself and what you hope to share with everybody today, just in general thesis.
Yeah, I think the main thing we wanted to kind of share with everybody is, as we look over customers, big, small, enterprise size, mid-size, high compliance, low compliance, what everybody is either missing or gaps that we see kind of across the board. Some of them revolve around technologies people are missing, and other of these just revolve around actually using the products that you've already got. One of the interesting things we see is that the list hasn't really changed much since COVID, but even though the list hasn't changed much, kind of the interpretation of it or the context around it has changed. So I think those would be the key things to really cover.
Well, one of the things I wanted to mention to everybody here as we're talking to make this, there are some folks we're going to call. We have a live inbound. You can either put your question right into the chat feed on the your platform of choice, or you can send a text to 410-320-6433. If my team can put that out on social, that would be good. 410-320-6433. Or if you're really ambitious, you can just call the phone. But either way, we're going to be making some outbounds that we know some folks really want to get some questions, but feel free to put your own. That's what makes this fun and makes it real practical to everybody who doesn't have to travel anywhere. You can just sit by your phone or sit and listen to us talk about this. All right, so let's talk about the cloud and some things we're seeing. We talk a lot when people come into RedZone about SSL and the importance of SSL. And it takes a while for a lot of folks to really understand that, because we've been talking about SSL for about 20 years, port 443. And now with cloud, it used to be just 443 on one firewall, or maybe as many firewalls as your remote sites. But now it's quite a bit different. Let's talk about, what are your thoughts on SSL security in the cloud and in today's modern architecture? Well,
so one question we get asked a lot is, now that everybody's working from home, can we stop trying to do SSL decryption because it's a pain? And it is a pain, and the more expensive the firewall, the more of a pain it really is, because they don't handle it very well. But with everyone being out of the office, one of the questions we get is, well, if no one's in the office, why do we need it? And so a good parallel that we can draw for that is we just had to help an association out with a hack attempt. And if they had DPI SSL or SSL decryption and outbound protocol control protecting those systems, even though the systems are in AWS or Azure, that hack would not have happened. And so we're really just changing the context, whereas before COVID, we'd be talking about the biggest risk is what are all the users doing. And now that everyone's left the office, there's still the risk of, okay, if the bad guys are compromising the environment and trying to phone home or trying to get out, this same kind of concept of SSL decryption and outbound protocol control really still applies. And if anyone is getting sucked into things like the CMMC or going through some of the SOC compliance pieces like that, even there, outbound control is still really important. And so one of the things that we're seeing shifting in today's world is people are forgetting that all of their servers are endpoints too. And it doesn't matter where the server is. So even if the server's in the cloud, that's still an endpoint. That endpoint still needs outbound port control. And there's a lot of protections that can be had for that. Now, in a post-COVID world, you have to kind of present that into the work from home and make sure that you've got what we used to call follow me content filtering, that when they go home, it follows them. Well, now they are home, so you're hoping it already did follow them and they have content filtering and those kinds of things at home. But really, it's just two sides of the same coin. But I can say that we've had to deal with quite a few, let's call it enterprise level hacks or high level data center hacks, and all of them would have been prevented by just doing the normal SSL decryption and outbound protocol control that we've been talking about for the last 2 years. And despite that, some firewalls make it difficult, or worse yet, as people have migrated to the cloud, they have decided not to put firewalls in the cloud. That's not helping matters. And so the ability to make sure that you treat your cloud as a real data center and make sure that you've got some kind of true firewall, just like you would, and you treat Azure and AWS and these things exactly like you would your own data center. That's what's really going to prevent that style of hack. And we've actually seen where it'll also help lower the amount of spam and phishing attacks you get, because there does seem to be a correlation between whether you control your outbound protocols and how much spam you get inbound and how many phishing attacks you get inbound, because all of these kind of security risks play off each other.
So, yep, because we often get hired as is the outsourced CISO, not always from just the thought leader perspective, but like the real practical granular technologies. And I was having a conversation about I was with a CISO recently, and he said, I have 700 employees used to be behind 35 office locations. Now I have 700 remote offices, not 35. And this is going all the way down to what these folks are printing at home. Like what actually, so the security is actually the technology around SSL security, but then it's like, what actually are people doing with their machines that they used to do when they were behind four walls, but now they're at home and all the job functions. So what are your thoughts on that?
So it's interesting. When COVID first happened, we expected to see an uptick in the amount of activity monitoring or employee productivity monitoring that people wanted to have. But there was a big burst of people really trying to work from home as COVID first started. And so we didn't see the boost in that we really expected. What I think is interesting is now that COVID keeps extending out, there is a rise now of people who want to see that what is that performance level at home like? What are people actually doing at home? And it relates to things like, what are they printing? Do we allow them to print? It went from, this is just temporary, we'll let it work, to, okay, the accounting guy needs 4 monitors at home, and how do we make those 4 monitors work? And how does it work with our RDS or Citrix server? So as it becomes more, quote unquote, permanent, people really want to see that. And so we're seeing an uptick definitely in that activity monitoring to be able to look at it and say, what are people doing? And in a way, what this is replacing is, kind of the old-fashioned SIEM philosophy, right? Because if no one's in the office, the SIEM's not gathering a lot of data. It's gathering great data for the data center and for the servers, but there's no humans behind there anymore. So unless you happen to have a SIEM system that's reaching out on every endpoint and tracking everything, you kind of have a gap in that visibility. And I think that's where that activity tracking is starting to pick up, because if you have abnormal amounts of printing or you have abnormal application usage, before it'd be caught onto your firewall. Now you kind of have to bridge that back down to the endpoint, either related to next gen AV or cloud security, or just that pure activity monitoring that says, okay, what's going on? What are people searching? How long do they spend sitting there just chatting to each other versus actually doing emails, doing spreadsheets, logging into the production systems? And there are solutions that will absolutely do it. They don't care that no one ever logs into the data center anymore. Most of the good systems nowadays don't care if you're VPN'd in. Kind of the traditional was you had to be VPN'd in, and so that really curtailed what you could do, what you could see. But nowadays, none of that matters. Everything's really more cloud friendly. So a lot of that stuff you can just see straight from the endpoint into the service cloud.
So with just as this topic, this SSL decryption and outbound. So are you seeing that? So now people have assets in their traditional data center, now potentially a co-location facility,
Yep.
then potentially Azure or AWS.
Yep.
And so SSL decryption, both inbound and we're particularly talking about outbound.
Mm-hmm.
So how does someone watch that at scale? So you're not having to remote into a multiple of different firewalls. Like, how is SSL managed, or how would you want to see it managed moving forward?
Well, so one of the good things.
Why is outbound important to why is outbound important to manage to begin with?
So outbound's important because it's A, what hides most of your key indicators of compromise. It's B, how most exfiltration happens, and command and control phone home. There has to be some kind of outbound connection for that to happen. And it is kind of your high watermark for what traffic is going on in the environment. So as users have left the environment, then things coming in should be the services you're providing. When things going out don't match the services you're providing, you have an issue. Because, for example, your domain controller shouldn't be browsing the internet, right? Your your finance system shouldn't be sitting there going to download sites. These are things that really shouldn't happen. And what we see is there's really been an uptick in what we see as those risks of uncontrolled outbound because of the philosophy change of people who are at home. I don't have to worry about it. And we're seeing kind of an immediate impact on just pure the number of calls we get. So the number of people call us in pain, panicked because of outbound, something outbound control would have fixed, is rising dramatically. And the funny thing is, because the users have left, it actually means SSL decryption and outbound protocol control is even easier because there's no people. And that was actually the hardest parts of those technologies was people, especially executives and stuff like that wanted to do whatever they wanted. I'm pointing at you on purpose as our model of difficulty.
I don't break SSL.
But the people that were hard are now at home, and so the only thing left is the servers. And really, from an IT perspective, if you don't know what your servers are supposed to be doing, you've got a whole different problem.
Okay, so you're saying that all the people are home, so I don't have to deal with people complaining about trying to go to different sites and tuning certs on the firewall, which is what outbound. That's what makes it hard.
This will make it hard, yeah.
And fail is when you can't at scale tune the certs across a wide user population. But now they're at home, so that excuse is off the table. So now you just want to make sure the assets that remain aren't going to use Uzbekistan without you knowing. They're not phoning someplace and channeling out. You want to take the firewall's advanced services and run it on that protocol.
Correct.
Because that protocol typically is just going to scoot out the firewall and not be examined, right?
Okay. Yeah. Or another good example is a lot of people were whitelisting things like Microsoft, which is always a bad idea, or Google. And so we'll go in and we'll see a server, and that server will be hitting, if you break apart SSL, that server will be hitting a Google Docs library or a OneDrive or a SharePoint library, where normally it should be talking to Azure services, but it should not be going to a file drop, because that's another really easy way people do command and control for ransomware, or exfiltrate data by just shoving a file up there or a text stream up there. And without that control, you're really kind of missing those things, because the servers still need to talk to the cloud. As things become more and more cloud ready, you have an interaction between your servers and the cloud. And whether that's at AWS or on-prem, it doesn't really matter. We're talking about all of them universally. And when we talk about things like outbound protocol control and decryption, it works best where you have to have a similar, if not equal, platform doing the control across all of those sites. So, for example, if you've got the baked-in AWS firewall at AWS, and then you have some kind of a virtual Palo over at Azure, but then you have a ASA over at corporate, you're never going to get a good visibility of what's going on, and you'll never get all of them set up to be equal. And what we're finding is the more unequal they are, the more at risk people are for getting compromised. Two of the compromises I was referring to that have happened in the last couple of weeks, compromises all started in people's public, generally WordPress web system, where everyone thought it doesn't matter. It's just the www. It's just marketing. Nobody cares. Almost all of the hacks started there and then bridged in from there. And often that's because people are doing combined services and they push stuff to the cloud in a hurry, but no one really realized that, hey, that AWS deployment of WordPress or Azure deployment of WordPress can talk to your other cloud infrastructure, which can then talk to corporate. And so you just have this daisy chain of contagion that walks through the environment. And standard, basic, really boring firewalls would have prevented most of those types of attacks.
But you're saying get rid of the multitude of difference and standardize on one platform.
Absolutely.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and even the manageability makes sense. Do we have a call? Do we have a caller that? Okay, we have a caller. We're going to dial that caller, but we're going to get him on. One of the most famous internet figures recently, George Pryor. George, we're about ready to call you. So I think one of the things is the critical firewall optimizations we were going to talk about in this section on SSL decryption and outbound protocol control. What do you think if someone is, George, we'll be right with you. What would you say, James, is the two critical firewall optimizations that are most important? Or maybe it's one, or maybe it doesn't matter. Just get on the same platform. But what comes to mind?
It's getting on the same platform, and it's getting everything set up to an equal footing.
Okay.
Too often we see that the data center is very secure, the DR site is not, the colo is questionable because the people supporting the colo don't want to play, or people are out at a managed colo, which means someone else is managing the firewall, and they don't even want to tell you what the rule base is, much less do the security you want. That's really where we're seeing the issues. I can tell you that some of the hacks that we were privy to, involve people in that Fortune 500 plus range that are supposed to be expert at IT services, and they still couldn't actually manage their stuff. And one of the reasons for that is they don't have to show their clients their rule bases. And so you're just supposed to trust them. And it's, hey, I'm a Fortune 500. You got to trust me. I have a SOC compliance and all these other stamps. But at the end of the day, their rule bases were very weak and they got compromised. And so we're really in something that we've always pitched, which is you should have visibility, if not co-management, at least visibility into those environments, because it's your stuff. And you got to know that it's actually configured and protected. And as people made the mad rush to the cloud and that escalated with COVID, what we found is less and less of those service providers are actually doing the security they claim, or while it might be on, it's not doing anything useful. And part of that's because they can't take the calls. They want to get everybody into the cloud. They can't actually do support calls at the same time. So they leave things pretty much wide open to get you in there.
So you have the most amount of flexibility, which is not what you necessarily want on the firewall side. Well, we have got a caller that's waiting to talk right now. And I encourage everybody to go to LinkedIn and find George Pryor, Prior. George is one of my favorite LinkedIn buddies. So, George, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Bill. How are you?
Very good. I welcome you to this live defense innovation security session. Do you have a question that you'd like to ask us today?
I would love to find out how organizations are implementing PKI in a more contemporary manner. It is a painful way to implement, to issue digital certificates or CAC cards or whatever it is to secure inbound and outbound email. And I'm very curious if anyone on your panel has taken the deep plunge in how they've done that.
Thanks, George. So this is centered on PKI and secure email.
Yeah, I mean, from what we've seen outside of very specific government agencies, the count of people who have done it is 0 in production. There are people who have done some very unique or specific point A to point B or recipient A to recipient B. But for the most part, I can't name a single one we've dealt with in the last couple of years that's really successfully pulled off that kind of PKI infrastructure. And the same goes for things like DMARC and DKIM as an example. It's a different part of email security, but it's kind of the same issue where you can set up things as great as you want, but if everybody on the outside hasn't also done their side of the lifting, it doesn't do a ton. And so the issue we're seeing more and more is that there's all of this great security, whether it be DNSSEC or whether it be DKIM or DMARC or whether it be doing digitally signed messages. The other side doesn't do it as well, or more importantly, the people that you are selling to don't support it, and then the projects end up being kind of a quick death, from what we've seen. So sadly, I'd have to say that the count of people who have done it successfully that we've dealt with is zero. And the closest we've seen people come, if they're talking specifically just about secure email, is doing the third-party cloud secure route, either on the Microsoft E5 route or something like the traditional Zix side or Ironport side.
Yeah, that's what I was afraid you were going to say. It's very painful, using either DigiCert or Identitrust to deal with that. I wish that at some point Microsoft or Google would come out with an enterprise way that you could, in the cloud, deploy a PKI solution, but I guess it's just not there yet.
Yeah.
To be stay tuned, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the funny thing is, we've seen people saying, well, if I can't do that, I'm just going to do more of like I almost want to say freeware version of encrypting messages. And then what becomes fun there is by decrypting it, by encrypting it, you're hiding it from all the security in between, right? And so then if someone in your organization accidentally gets infected and sends a consumer or a customer or a client a virus, well, you're the one who encrypted it and hid it from their security. So now it's even more your fault that I got the virus. So there's this whole liability aspect that comes with it that people don't really think about until all of a sudden one of those bad things happen. And with everybody working from home, phishing and malware and emails coming from compromised systems is kind of on the rise again. So that becomes a concern as well, especially when people's general consoles or risk VPs get involved.
George, are you seeing much happening with government contractors and CMMC or any of those requirements impacting you or any of your peers?
Yes. As you know, CMMC, I think they just about closed the comment period. There's been some consternation, especially on the Professional Services Council, around the short timeline. But interestingly enough, I don't know if you saw, but GSA has said that they won't make that a hard requirement until 2025, which is really strange that they would wait that long. They were so lax in 800-171. So I thought that they were going to, make it more aggressive. But most definitely, CMMC is really a business imperative. And in fact, if you're not working towards that, I would be really concerned, because so many of those control items in there are just good, plain common sense items. And I'm shocked. I've talked to some of my peers. They're still dealing with POAMs for 800-171, which is disconcerting.
Well, we found a really interesting thing, George, where we've got some clients that are in that space, and they're talking with kind of the master contract holders that are supposed to already be NIST compliant. And they've been asked to turn off some security because what was happening with the people they were emailing is, because they were working from home and because everybody kind of deployed out for COVID, their systems weren't actually built to handle it. So we actually had to help customers turn off some of their security so that these people they were emailing could actually open the emails, because once they left the office, however they rigged up their stuff couldn't handle it. And so it was really, and for us, it was kind of funny that we're sitting there with customers who are just trying to do normal due diligence, quote unquote, do the right thing, like you were saying for NIST and CMMC. They're dealing with people who are supposed to already be compliant, and those are the ones who couldn't handle it, not the small, medium businesses that we were working with. So we thought that was a really weird twist that kind of came out of COVID, is those requests from, serious enterprise folks you wouldn't expect that say, oh yeah, we need you to turn encryption off so our people can read the emails at home. It just boggles the mind.
Well, interestingly enough, I can't speak to Android, but on iOS, if you're an Office 365 customer and you've got the necessary license, obviously you can install Outlook mobile, and it supports SMIME, and you just have to toggle that. So I'm shocked that someone would actually want you to turn off email encryption so that they could read email on either Outlook or Outlook mobile. They must not be on the most up-to-date client. So that's kind of disconcerting someone would actually do that, because that defeats the entire secure transmission of sending SMIME.
Yep.
But
we're right there.
Stranger things have happened. Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
George, thank you for calling in.
We appreciate it, Bill. I'm happy to be part of these programs, and look forward to the next opportunity to participate.
Well, appreciate it very much, George. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care, all. Bye-bye.
Bye. So I think, as we look at migration to the cloud, it was interesting back in January, or even most of last year, we were talking about ATO, account takeover attacks, and cloud security and how to secure cloud applications, because clearly SaaS applications they weren't just spawned in 2019. It was been happening for years. But now that we're in 2020, I think the conversation is really accelerated as far as how do I secure my cloud applications? And that's a big question, because it's like saying someone's nice. What does that really mean? So how do we secure our cloud apps? And I think what we're going to talk about is kind of a layered approach, but let's talk about what ATO means for you, like account takeover means for you. Like, what would be indicative of an account being taken over?
I mean, to me, there's a couple things for account takeover. The simplest of which is someone accesses your account and then uses it against other people. Everybody kind of thinks of security from the kind of selfish, self-oriented version of, oh, someone compromised my account, they might read my emails or steal my file. Most people who are going to do an account takeover, they don't care about you. They're looking at your account so they can go prey on somebody else. Most of what we get involved with is really a downstream attack where whoever has been compromised is being used to, steal or affect or push around somebody else. And so, we define that account takeover not necessarily as protecting yourself, but protecting the people from your accounts. And that's where we see a lot of the ACH wire transfer frauds happen. That's where we see a lot of the
so it's a person,
spear phishing.
Someone logging in to impersonate someone.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And the cloud makes it even easier because one of the things that becomes dangerous is with the cloud, you can basically put a tap, right? And so a lot of security is based around someone accessed Bill's email and then sent an email as Bill, right? Sure. That's getting easier and easier to catch, right? And if we implement good cloud app security, then we can catch that across Microsoft and Google and OneDrive and Box and all that stuff and kind of get a universal view of all these different third parties all collected together. But the cloud also gives you the ability to do basically a tap that says, okay, I only touched you once. There's one spurious record that looks really, really innocent, but now I get a copy of things, or now I get visibility without logging back in. This will be a good example of things like MFA, right? People don't often buy the right Microsoft license, so they don't put in MFA and Conditional Access correct, or they depend solely on something like Duo or Okta or something like that, and they don't actually close off the Microsoft-centric areas. And then you have the ability to do things like add what George was talking about, which is an iOS device. often you can have those devices set up that once you hook into the account, it's not going to ask you for another validation or verification or anything for 30 plus days, right? So that's potentially a long period of time I can be watching your account, right? And then I see you send something interesting to George Pryor. And so then I make a fake RedZone Tech domain, and I send George an email as Bill, faking that domain. And some of those can be really difficult to see,
Sure.
a missing letter or an extra letter, or chop off the H at the end or add an M somewhere, and what's difficult about that is, it's my fake domain. I own it. I can set up the security so it's perfect. And then I'm depending on George to know that even though I have your entire email string in there because I cut and pasted it, and even though I sound exactly like you because I've been watching what you do for weeks, that I'm not you, and that becomes really difficult. So account takeover is important because it helps prevent things like that. But it's all integrated. Account takeover is integrated with SSO. It's integrated with the conditional access and MFA. All of those is really what's important, because without all of them working together, there's all of these different backdoor ways to get in. And those backdoor ways to get in are really tough because you've got these security walls that you've built, but then you sent everybody home, which kind of changed the nature of those walls. And so now those backdoors are more prevalent. They're simpler. And so security in layers, as you mentioned, it's account takeover, it's cloud app security, it's conditional access, it's MFA. You actually need all of these things now. And if you don't have all of them, the ability for someone to subvert basically your world is quite simple.
So in a cloud vendor that won't give you, that just gives you certain, we can pick on Salesforce, we can pick on any enterprise Salesforce system, not just Salesforce themselves, 365, Dropbox, Box. So they all have their own ways of authenticating. And so are you saying that the Microsoft MFA with Active Directory, with Azure AD, and no matter what you choose as a third party above that level, you have to get Microsoft correct? Because you see some people just subverting Microsoft and saying, no, we're going to let Okta or Duo or RSA handle the authentication. And where do you see that being problematic?
We see a big mix of that. So for example, we're in one environment where they've used Salesforce for a while. They have Azure AD, they have 365, they have this whole MFA stack, but their Salesforce or ADP is still using an old LDAP federation that's going just straight into their domain controller. Because back when they set it up, that was really the only way you could do it. SAML 3, what have you, old fashioned. But what that also means is a lot of the systems that are using AI to come up with what is Bill's usage pattern on the cloud, well, that's going to bypass it, right? Because it's kind of an out of band authentication. And so we do see where people have, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But people just forgot about it. Like, why would you go look at how your Salesforce is working? Because it's working, right? There's nothing wrong with it. But in today's world, you have to look at it, because with everyone leaving the building and with more and more cloud being implemented, and there's always some difficulties with cloud logs hitting your SIEM the same way on-prem logs used to hit your SIEM, that you really have to look at that to make sure you have the right data set. Because the more combined that data set is, the better. So for example, I could have cloud app security go through and do a bunch of third parties and Microsoft and then combine them together. Or I can make sure everybody is doing proper SSO with Azure AD, and all of that data is already 90% right there. And I just have to get some extra context from those third party vendors. One equals a lot better security than the other, and it's also a lot simpler. We used to always fight about provisioning, deprovisioning, who's got a deprovisioning system. And nowadays, it seems like the more people have truly embraced, I'll just pick on Microsoft, Azure AD and the abilities that it has, whether you use it with Okta or not, doesn't matter. These things all play together. Sure. It really did away with a lot of those concerns about provisioning, deprovisioning, because half that stuff is automatic. And everybody's supporting it now. because users are at home. They know they can't rely on old systems like Imprivata that we sold back in the day, or screen scrape SSO or RSSO systems. They actually have to be SSO. And a lot of that works really, really well. So almost redeploying the old SaaS apps as cloud apps is a good way to kind of get everything
Do you
pulled
think
together.
people tried to rig some of these SaaS providers into their on-prem world using sort of old strategies, but now they need to really look at an API-based integration with their cloud broker, whether that be Microsoft's MFA conditional access solution or some other third party. But ultimately, the more you get Microsoft correct from a core fundamentals, will assist in the provisioning, deprovisioning, and process.
It also helps with the integration too. So as a good example, we're playing with a finance system, and that finance system can use Okta. And so it's great. Okay, I've got Okta. But if I do it the Microsoft way, it'll also integrate how some of the invoicing comes out of the system, how some of the file sharing comes out of the system. If I do it the Okta way, it does not. If I do it the Microsoft way, it does. And so on one hand, one's a third party and it's a little bit more convenient for some IT reasons. But on the other hand, one's a lot more convenient to the finance group because everything's integrated. It works basically flawlessly automatically. And I think that's something that people are going to have to embrace, because Windows 10 is really built from almost a 365 manner versus a operating system manner. And then, of course, it's hard to find a business today that doesn't use Office 365 and Microsoft for email, at least in our B2B space. And so that kind of integration is really useful. It's really more important now that everyone's working from home, because that integration means it's going from system to system and not system to PC at someone's house to system, right? And then you have this whole risk point where things had to flow through that PC to get back.
Yeah. Are you seeing people sharing devices right now, or still using their corporate assets 100%?
On the PC side, we're still seeing people mostly using corporate devices. But when it comes to, and this is where the employee and activity monitoring comes into play, we're finding that people are wandering around and just using their home tablets or iOS devices or phones and just answering kind of emails at home. And they're not doing the full gamut of work that should be done on, let's say, their corporate laptop. So from a productivity thing, we see a risk where it has the appearance of people fully jacked in and working, but not the actuality of it. But then it's also a risk because it means you have these devices that are kind of uncontrolled. And that's kind of the second point of view of cloud app security. Is the first point of view is account takeovers and account takeover attacks. But then the second piece is, well, what do we do with these uncontrolled devices? And if I'm a bad guy and I drop a 0-day in your OneDrive, that's automatically going to sync to your phone or your tablet. And it's like, okay, well, what do you have there? You don't have next-gen AV. You probably don't even have normal AV on it. How are you protecting that? And by the way, that also has my Salesforce app and my login to a dozen other things. And with the amount of people we talk to who don't have a password management system, that probably has a Word document that has all your passwords on it that those files all search for. And so the real risk there is all of that happens almost automatically. And so you need that API base that like you're talking about, because the API level of antivirus that comes with the cloud app security protections is really going to sit there and say, okay, before this does sync to Bill's iOS device, let me make sure that it's safe before it gets there. And Microsoft has some protections with that, but people use more Microsoft. They're using Box, they're using Dropbox, they're using G Suite.
Cloud app security, I think, is confusing because Microsoft has the same name. And for those listening, we've been big proponents of the SonicWall platform, and are they still calling it the same name as Microsoft?
Still calling it Cloud App Security.
I mean, I think that has an advantage in one hand, but then I think it also gets confusing because then from a buyer perspective, you're like, well, what is James talking about, Microsoft or SonicWall? Like, it immediately is confusing.
And the honest answer is a little bit of each. There are some things you can do with Microsoft's E5 package for what they call Cloud App Security that does help with the account takeover protection. But then on the Microsoft side, you would need to merge that with a lot of the Defender E5 pieces to get more of that advanced sandboxing and kind of API level. However, that again doesn't then help the third party. So if you're using Force.com applications or Salesforce and sharing data with your clientele, you're missing that whole area of data sharing because Microsoft's not integrated with that and looking.
Sure.
If you're more on that kind of third-party API side, then you can bridge into each one of those and make sure, okay, does my CRM application in Force or does my data sharing application? Because more and more we see more data sharing, right? People want to make sure that if people are at home, they can get to a place, the clients can get to a place, and it's a safe place for both parties. That kind of cloud sharing has inherent risk. And if you don't have something on the background protecting your clients from you and you from your clients, then that risk can go south pretty quick.
So cloud app security, then, I mean, there's a book out called Exponential Organizations. It's probably 5 years now, but it talked about the role of the CIO needing to dominate APIs. And this was written, in the cloud world 5 years ago, and they were thinking about it just from data and the need to transport data around, and it's become really important in the security world, becoming good at APIs for sure. Do you think that not many people use Microsoft for backup? So I think it's probably strong to use a third party as a shim. I know you don't like the word shim, but what do you think? Do you think an API is a shim, or do you think it's more of a?
Well, so the book you're talking about is talking about APIs to replace kind of your old business-to-business data transfers, and APIs are definitely become the king for that. But from a IT security perspective, one way to think of APIs that's a little bit different is technically properly setting up your SSO is the king of all APIs. At the end of the day, no matter what protocol you use or what access you use, really what you're talking about is an authentication API between all of the different systems. And so if the CIO is being focused on IT administration and security and infrastructure, that's really the API they should be worried about, is their authentication API. And everything bridges from that, whether it's SIEM for log monitoring or threat hunting through your logging. If you don't have your authentication API baked and really integrated, you're going to have the same issues you had with traditional systems like BizTalk and things like that, where you're like, okay, these three vendors are going to FTP me a file. These guys are going to email me a file. And then you're going to tell someone to keep all that straight.
Yeah, keep it straight.
And so on the business side, they built the APIs to make that more universal, so they can do things like data loss prevention and fraud analysis, things like that. But to do that, you needed to make everything equal.
There was in the 2005, I remember I used to fly to the Burton Group conferences, and they were the identity kings. This is back in PKI, back to George's question, when they were trying to figure out ways to do PKI certs and securing kind of the first generation of digital infrastructure. And they often said that whoever controlled identity was going to win. And the problem is no one wanted the liability in the day. And so identity now is dominated by Microsoft. It's just clear winner there, at least from the corporate side. And it seems to me that and I know if a couple of our customers are listening, they argue about that, mainly because of the religious battle of Microsoft owning anything. But to your point that authentication is king, and if a CIO can dominate the SSO and authentication, they win. They 100% win.
Another thing you can consider an API is going to be file sharing. That's another infrastructure and security level API. And much like authentication, if you don't give the business a way to do it, they're going to find their own way, and it's going to be inconvenient and defeat security, right? Because what we run into is people who got a malware, got a virus. We say, well, where did it come from? And they say, well, I had to share files with this customer, so we just used their personal Dropbox or OneDrive or what have you. The business, and at the end of the day, it's all going to end up being the business's fault, not the client's, right? That's just the way people's perception is going to go. So file sharing could be considered another one of those APIs where you want to make sure that you've given the business a facility to share that the business controls. And really, the authentication API example where we say Microsoft's in charge. It's not really Microsoft that's in charge. The business is in charge, and using Microsoft to make all of these third parties do it one single way. You got to do the same thing for file sharing for the business. Say, okay, these are the 3 file shares we support because we can control the security. We've got cloud app security. We can see what comes in, what goes out. If someone's misusing it, and make sure that that's presented.
So truly now they can be the department of yes. They can be. It's not a question of how.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is a question of how, but now we can actually. In the back in the day, people were shadow IT was a problem because A, nobody was going through the CIO, but B, there was no way to secure it. Even there was no. Now there's 100% ways to secure it. So really, you can turn it on. Yeah, Keith, how are you?
I'm great.
Pretty good. And let me put you on speaker here. I appreciate you calling in.
Yeah, thanks for the invite to join in.
Yes. How's Philadelphia?
Beautiful day here today.
Excellent. Excellent.
We'll visit sometime.
Well, we hope to. We aim to. Well, I appreciate you calling in. Let's. What's your question today?
All right. Well, you briefly touched on this earlier, and I'm very interested in hearing more about point 4 of your agenda here, next gen antivirus and client security. But I wanted to take it a step further as we expand from maybe 1 or 2 offices to everybody having a remote office. What are your thoughts on ways to identify your most at-risk users?
So from our point of view, don't. And the reason I say that is when we talk to folks and they say, okay, here's my at-risk users, they're generally wrong because they'll sit there and say, well, my at-risk users are the people who have access to the most data. Okay, that's a good point of view. Or my at-risk users are the executives because they're the most likely to get the spear phishing attack and make people accidentally give out payroll info and stuff like that. That's also a good point of view. Or they'll come back and they'll say, my most at-risk users are the people on the oldest machines. That was always true in an on-prem environment and also in a work-from-home environment. But then again, the people on the newer stuff are also probably using the newest versions of shadow IT that's the least controlled. So you could almost argue any segmentation of at-risk user to try to make it invalid. And the reason I kind of say it from that point of view is because, and especially in a cloud world, impersonation is so important. Is anybody really different at this point, right? Is anybody truly more at risk than another? There was a time when you could say, okay, the people traveling are more at risk because they're the ones running around and everybody's safe in the office. Okay, everyone's at home. Technically, they've traveled, right? They are now currently traveling almost permanently with the horrible travel companions of their children also at home on God knows what computer doing school stuff. So from a standpoint, all of that has kind of washed out. So now the real question is, who's really more at risk? To me, the argument would really be everyone's got equal risk because with impersonation, you're kind of hosed. And we've done completely away with effort. So what I mean by that is there are these clandestine attacks we hear about that had, all of these black hat experts that personally went to go hack party A. Does it happen? Sure, absolutely. Is that the most likely thing to happen? No, you're going to get hit by a bunch of automated stuff and automated scripts that don't care who you are and aren't targeting you. You just happen to fall in the radar of the IP addresses they're sweeping or the social media accounts they were pulling. So I'd have to say that we've kind of hit that philosophical stage of everyone's really got to be treated equal from a security aspect, because truly everyone is. That said, selfishly, I can tell you that when we go do assessments, typically what we hear is that the executive suite is usually the people who have the most risk and also have the least protections. So that's just a more specific example of where everyone needs to be treated equally, whether they are at risk or important, or they are rank and file and considered quote unquote safe. They're not. It's all universal to us.
Great. That's an interesting perspective. I appreciate the input.
Thanks, Keith, for jumping in.
Yeah, have a great one.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So as we look at next gen AV, are you seeing any? Do you think there's any clear? Do you think there's any clear winners?
I mean, yes and no. We've run into some clear losers.
Because I mean, it's interesting. A lot of folks are, you know, they're needing that advanced. Putting AI. The larger thing is, where do you have advanced AI and machine learning in your enterprise right now? Because it's literally too complex to manage it all of yourself. You need the machine helpers, and we certainly don't have ways of having multiple different vendors and having AI work correctly. You need to be on a solo platform as much as possible to make it work. But I'm curious just what your thoughts are and in the kind of leapfrogging from antivirus to next gen AV.
I mean, the thing with next gen AV that we find is it needs to be part of a solution, not a software choice. You know, too often we see someone's like, okay, here's the name brand, I'm going to go buy it. It's like, okay, great, but what's it really going to do for you? And how does it mesh with everything else that you have? We've got one next gen vendor that some of our clients work with that when we try to rig it into their SIEM or SOCs, we run into issues where this supposed next gen vendor that is totally cloud compatible, helps with the work from home. If I want to get the logs out of it, I have to go build a crappy Linux appliance, implement it in my own data center. It'll periodically go out and pull the cloud vendor, suck it down to a flat file, and then convert that to syslogs that it'll slowly at some random interval parse out to my SIEM system. Okay, I had next gen AV, but that's not really useful at that point because I can't really get the proper alerts out of it. Or we find that some of the next gen AVs are assuming that you're going to go dedicate a human to stare at a screen. You know, and so we find it's like, okay, if everyone's working from home, we don't have time to stare at dozens of screens. We need next gen AV that's actually going to pick up and do something. Yeah. So the thing that we look at from a next gen AV is one, it's that AI driven. Two is that it's got some kind of dedication. We are starting to run into more and more of things that class themselves as next gen AV, but then some of them want to be an EDR or an MDR or one of the new acronyms. And it's like an unholy alliance of advanced antivirus and some logging and some thread control and some host intrusion. And when we look at those systems, what we usually find is they're tweaked down so low because they're so chatty and annoying that you kind of lost some of the impact because you're not a DoD skiff where you control everything, right? You've got people at home who just scream, at the bosses that they can't do their job, and IT gets told, go turn it off or go make it be quiet. And so from a next gen aspect, our point of view is you need to figure out what you want to get out of it. The big thing that we want to see come out of a next gen AV is ultimate 0-day sandboxing. I want to see that.
That's important because a lot of vendors use that word sandboxing. And people think of a small little child sitting in a sandbox throwing sand at someone.
Yep.
And how do you define sandboxing?
So the sandbox has to be multiple layers.
My son, I should say.
The sandbox has to be multiple layers. It has to run through multiple different styles of sandboxing. It should be doing it all at the same time. If the vendor can't give an SLA for that, then you should not be using that vendor. But it should hit multiple sandboxes all at the same time. The sandboxes have to be able to hide from the bad guys. A lot of them don't. There's a lot of ransomware that once they see you looking, they just uninstall themselves, which is great for you, bad for actually catching the bad guy. But it's got to have those different layers of sandboxing, and it has to be advanced enough that they are searching for things like eternal blue attacks, side channel attacks, things like that. Sure. You're not just looking for a file that calls a process. You have to be looking for something that does a memory-based attack or a chip-based attack, and you want to be able to see that. To us, that's the most important part of a next-gen AV. There are a lot of simpler, easier ways to do other types of controls that are a bit more helpful. Because this is one of the few cases where the Swiss Army knife style solution tends to not do anything well. And that's almost worse than having 2 or 3 key products that do their job well and having some gaps in the others. which is the opposite of when we talk about firewalls, where we're like, okay, time to make the world simpler. This is your edge. It's been running this way for a couple of decades. We can use a UTM. That's our Swiss Army knife for our firewalls, even if it's out at Azure or AWS. That's good. Next gen AV is so new, and endpoints are changing so rapidly. That's one of the cases where you need the best of breed for that, not a solution that kind of does a half-ass a bit of everything.
No, I've come up with these analogies recently, but in finance, you rarely see in the small mid-market finance department holding all of capabilities in-house themselves. Usually they're outsourcing some component, whether it's tax filing, payroll to a payroll service, or possibly accounts payable. But they're and the same thing legal. Rarely are they going to have a full suite of legal in-house. You're going to be partnered with a law firm to provide expert help and such. Where are you seeing on some of the themes, the four of the themes we've talked about? Where are you seeing through the 100 plus assessments we've done, the most struggle happening with the talent gaps and all the issues with?
The biggest struggle we see is people seeing the letters MSP or MSSP and deciding it means what they think it means versus what the vendor defines themselves as. And I know it's a stupid thing to bring up, but it's really the biggest struggle we see, because we'll talk to folks and they'll say, no, I've got this thing from Carbon Black. They're the MSSP. And I'll pick on that as an example. We'll look at the solution they're having, and the expectation is there is someone running that system. They're thinking they have outsourced to humans, and it's just a fancy piece of software, and the expectation is there are humans running it. And so there's a naming clash that really makes people misunderstand the level of service that they're getting.
The level of remediation or the level of,
I'm going to say the level of service blanketly, whether it's inspection, remediation, what have you. We've actually dealt with 2 data centers right now that are a managed data center. They're supposed to be fully MSP, MSSP. They use all the buzzwords. They're managing all of that stuff. We go in and we do an assessment. We find out that I can actually sit on the domain controllers and freely hit, bad servers in China, Uzbekistan. You pick a country, we can hit it. We were able to transfer data back and forth. And when we go to them, the only answer that we get from those providers is, "Oh no, it's safe. Don't worry about it. We're the MSSP." It's like, well, what does that really mean? What are you giving me?
It's an anointing.
Yeah, they got a blessing and they're good to go. And a lot of the hacks we got are about that. And so where we see the biggest struggle is that designation. Is this person providing you a product, in which case they are not doing the mental effort to make sure you're safe. They're doing the low cost effort to make sure they don't get calls because their margin is very thin. That's why their cost is going down, versus an MSSP where they are providing a service, and the goal is to make sure those products work right. And so, for example, we're on the make sure the products work right point of view, but especially on the managed colo side and even the secure colo side, as an example, they're selling a product. They're calling it a managed service, but it's really a managed service product, not a program.
It's a good way to look at it as product versus program, because that's why we stopped using the word MSP and MSSP here, because it was like saying, again, someone's nice. It doesn't mean anything, because when you start looking at you almost don't want to be associated with that acronym. It takes you down a rat hole that you can't recover from. So we came up, because I think the program part is most important. That's what we call it, co-managed IT security, commits. I like that. Commits, commits is a good ring to it. But co-managed IT security, because we're partnered with that organization to deliver the support needed for that. And I think that from an analogy perspective, looking at security like a team, and your team, like in soccer, is made up of 11 players. If you're missing the right back, you're going to lose. But it doesn't mean you have to have, it could be, you could steal that right back from another team that you're going onto the game day, and you're down a person and you recruit someone to fill in. They're essentially filling in for a period of time. Or you can go try to bring someone onto the team that's a permanent member. But either way, you got to have a right back. And I think that's the point we're at from MSP versus, it's not even on this list, but I think it is a stumbling point.
With all of those things, whether it's SIEM or MFA Or we'll talk to someone who's got MFA with, let's say, Duo, and then it turns out they've never secured the Microsoft side of the fence. And so they have this wonderful MFA protection going in, but you're freely able to back-end it from the other side, because what was good 5 years ago is not how the world works today, and they haven't redeployed it to be today's version.
Because Azure moves fast. They're upgrading constantly.
Fast,
they're not moving. Their upgrade cycles are weekly. But I was looking back at the notes from December and January, fully expecting this year was going to be the year of SIEM. We had five, six opportunities on the SIEM side that a lot of CIOs and their teams were trying to figure this out. So, and then all of a sudden, whammo, the COVID hit, and it's amazing how much people don't want to talk about SIEMs in the midst of a pandemic. But it also forces the other question is, do we need one? Because if we're blocking everything and we just need basic reporting.
Yeah, I mean, I would say for the last couple of years, we've been talking about people should block first and look less, right? And so if you're blocking first, then really your SIEM is an after effect. And it always has been. The whole goal to a SIEM is to tell you what happened, past tense. Right? Historical. Let's analyze and look at the logs and tell you what happened now that it's too late. And that's fine. And it has its job in forensics. It has its job in risk mitigation. But in terms of protect me, not so much.
So break the conversation into governance, GRC, governance, risk conversation versus IT SecOps.
Yep.
So if you're concerned about GRC, whodunit, cookie crumbs, Hansel and Gretel kind of stuff, then auditor, that would be SIEM, traditional thing, right? Okay.
And what we see is now that everyone is running around at home, everything is more diversified. People are in 365 more than they ever were before. People are on Windows 10. These systems are updating naturally whenever they want to, because everyone complained about being up to date. So Microsoft is shoving that down everyone's throat now. And so, in that world, the SIEM is even less valuable.
Like, why would Microsoft ever want to ingest the logs from Carbon Black?
They would actually. So you can get Microsoft Sentinel, and it will want to. The question is, will these cloud providers make it easy? Whether it's CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, any of these, are they going to make it easy to see the logs? And then the next piece that's very important is, are the logs any use? So for example, it's one thing and this to me is why SIEMs have been going downhill, is it's one thing to say you collect the logs, but then can you read the logs, and then can you do something useful with the logs? And the more and more we go to a SIEM vendor and really pin them out, you end up with the scope of, okay, here's all the logs we collect. This many we can do something really cool and useful and AI driven with. This level, we can let you search, but we can't really do any of the AI stuff with.
Useful? You keep using that word, do something useful, because I look at useful as being, there's only one use, block someone from entering my facility.
So useful would mean it has enough context that you could make the decision on whether you want to block it or not, or that it doesn't take a human hours to figure out whether they can block something or not when you really needed it blocked 5 seconds later. And I think as we shift people into that kind of next gen and shift people into that cloud ready, there is enough stuff out there blocking that should be really the focus, and the SIEM should be the backseat, if you will, or the option. Because when we talk about also cookie crumbs, the same things that enable those systems to block also enable those systems to track the visibility and the context that we need to go find the cookie crumbs. I can say for the most part that the last, let's say, 4 different compromises we had to deal with, none of them were helped by a SIEM. It was always the either manual human effort to go figure something out, or the blocking products are what were able to give us the cookie crumbs of what was happening to tell us where to go look. It has never really been the SIEM. And that's because just because a SIEM has a log doesn't mean it can present it to you in a helpful, useful manner. You could think of this as, let's say the system is getting input in 100 different languages. You speak one language. And it says, okay, well, I can translate these 20 for you naturally into English, this other 30 into really, really broken English that you're going to have to concentrate on to figure it out. And the rest of them, I'm just going to put naturally. So I hope you know what buzzwords to look for. Yeah, that's what it will do.
So to translate that would be like we were talking about before. You've got Palo doing some work here. You've got SonicWall doing some work here. You've got this endpoint protection from Microsoft. You've got routers that or switches that you just have to get in your SIEM system, and then you start looking at your cloud, and then all of a sudden you now got to force all that into a SIEM. And you and I have had this long talk about this. It's a win. You cannot win that game.
Cannot win that game.
However, we can shift the focus. Less is more. We can choke on less vendors, wider scope, and then the SIEMs actually we can make them work more intelligently.
Well, and most people, when they say I want a SIEM, if it's not for a specific government requirement, and it's easy to have a log archive, by the way, to make forensics people happy. You can have a huge data warehouse log archive to make them happy. That's simple. That's easy. That's not what most SIEM vendors sell anyway. But when we talk to clients and they say, I want a SIEM, you're like, well, what's the one thing you want? Well, I want to do threat hunting. Well, then go buy a threat hunting system. Stop buying a SIEM and saying you want threat hunting. And so that's the other reason that we're finding
we're back to
died.
acronyms. Back to acronyms again.
Right, because SIEM is a popular acronym.
Yeah.
And if you go read,
I just call it SIM.
well, SIEM, whatever. It's like HIPAA. There's like 4 different ways to say HIPAA. I'm not answering that. But in reality, though, if you look at some of the compliance requirements, they still say SIEM, but some of those things haven't been updated in 8 years. You can't follow a compliance framework that hasn't truly been updated in 8 years. The world's not the same as it was 8 years ago. 8 years ago, if you said work from home, you'd be talking about people that were on old DSL and were carefully VPNing into the environment. I mean, it's just a whole totally different world.
From the people, I think everybody listening, and I don't know if we're getting any questions coming in over here, but the main thing is putting blocking systems in first is going to be your most useful way to secure in the topic areas we're talking about. And then the last conversation is, all right, do I have an auditor that floats in here, and then I have to prove what I'm doing? I have to actually prove that I'm watching these logs. But and then where are they going to want to see that? And then solving that is a separate question. But we've got to be able to block at scale and use machine learning and artificial intelligence to scale out into our environments now. And we got to do this in a very measured way with SIEM.
And the other thing is SIEM is very expensive. Especially if you integrate everything, the integration alone is expensive. Getting all the third parties to do it is expensive. SIEM has a huge cost. And there's a segment of the security population that will say SIEM is absolutely necessary. You must have it. Anyone who doesn't have it's an idiot. You have to have a SIEM. You have to have a SOC, all the stuff. But then you have business reality of what can someone afford? What can someone afford in a COVID world? What can someone afford that's going to reach out and touch everybody work from home? And that's where practicality needs to override kind of old school thinking to say, okay, I get that SIEM important, but it's important at the end of the game. And I need to do all the precursors of the game to get there, because there's a lot of useful things I can do that protect me day in, day out on a daily basis. And I'd rather have those than something that'll tell me after the fact that I got hosed.
So, okay, so this was what we're seeing from the hundreds of risk assessments we've done, and sort of, I would say, the big five conversation points that we've covered today. I want to do this again because I want to get into some of the specific vendors that we're seeing challenges with, so people can start to understand the way we're seeing it. Because I think there's a certain value of just, when you touch a lot of environments, you have an advantage. You have the advantage of a lot of at-bats, a lot of at-bats, and the more at-bats you get, the more patterns we can recognize across things. So, any closing comments?
No, I think the biggest closing comment that we could come up with is, we have the luxury of seeing how we would do it, how other people do it. What their plans are, what their historics have been. And so, we like to take the point of view of, okay, let's look at the people who got hacked or subverted, and then how is that similar to what we see in everybody else? And that's kind of nice because it gives us that kind of predictive view that says, okay, this person had basically the same type of security you did. Here's how they got hacked. And we can kind of turn that around and say, okay, here's how you can not end up being them. And I think that's a useful exercise that we did when we came up with this list, but that we can also assist people with. And then I think common question we get are boil it down to two things to do. And the answer to that's always going to be SSO with MFA and outbound port protocol control. Like if those are the two things and the only things people get done before the end of the year, that's the best things for them to do.
Yeah, this is point 1 and point 3. And for those of you who are looking to shore up gaps in your team or gaps in programs and really looking for proactive team that can bolt into your team and work as a partner, this is what we do, and this is what the value that we provide day in and day out to the customers we're working with. So until next time, thanks everybody for listening, and have a great rest of the day.